The primary election is just around the corner, which means that campaign spending and attacks are ramping up. Discussing that with me today are Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News and Betsy Russell from the Idaho Press. Kevin, there are so many primary races that, and only on the Republican side, there's not a single Democratic legislative primary on the ballot on Tuesday. What races are you going to be watching?
Well, aside from the obvious statewide races, there are so many legislative primaries that are really interesting, that could really shift the balance of power within the Republican Party. I mean, you start in North Idaho with a really, really spendy race in District 1, the Senate race. Jim Woodward, the incumbent, Scott Herndon, the challenger with Bonner County Republican ties, all the way down to District 35 in the eastern corner of the state. You know, Chad Christensen has a really, really spendy challenge. Yeah, all up and down throughout the state. There are, I've identified probably close to 20 legislative races that are really interesting.
I'll definitely be keeping my eye on that District 1 race with Woodward and Herndon, and certainly with Chad Christensen and his challenger, Wheeler. Betsy, you have a whole list that you're going to be watching.
Oh, yeah. And just right here in the Treasure Valley, there are 4 races that, because of redistricting, feature incumbent versus incumbent. And so we know there's going to be change out of those. And some of those are really significant. Senators Abby Lee and Jim Rice are facing off in the primary, along with 2 other candidates. Representatives Judy Boyle and Scott Syme, only one of them will survive to be elected again. Senators Stephen Thane and Scott Grow, they're facing off, and Representative John Vanderwoude and Greg Furch. All of these are contests directly impacted and created by redistricting, but they tell us something about, what's going to change with existing, in some cases, longtime legislators who will be gone.
Well, I think the first one that you mentioned is a perfect example of that, with Senators Abby Lee and Jim Rice. One of them is in leadership. One of them is the Senate Local Government and Taxation Chairman, both prominent and powerful members of the Senate. And one of them, at least, is not coming back next year. And that's an interesting district. That's also home of the Judy Boyle-Scott Syme race, where a couple of the incumbents have an advantage over the others because of the way that redistricting played out.
Right. It isn't just that redistricting put these candidates together. You really have to kind of dig in and look at what the legislative districts look like and who is more familiar in these districts. I mean, Betsy pointed out in her reporting that when you look at the Abby Lee, Jim Rice race, that is much more of Abby Lee's old Senate district than it is Jim Rice's old Senate district. The Thane-Grow race is a really good example. I mean, Stephen Thane spent the past decade running and winning in this district that went from Gem County into Custer County and Lemhi County. All of those central Idaho counties are not in his legislative district anymore. Gem County is, but that's only 35% of the electorate, 36% of the electorate in that new legislative district. So you would think that those numbers might favor Scott Grow.
But at the same time, Stephen Thane has been in the legislature, first in the House and then in the Senate, for much longer than Senator Grow. And that could be an advantage for him, too.
Right, and it might really just come down to campaigning in different ways in new legislative districts. I mean, a Stephen Thane or a Jim Rice or some of these other incumbents, they can't rely on word of mouth. They can't rely on name ID in their old districts. It's not a matter of just going door to door and meeting up with folks who've supported you in the past. Maybe you have to do more advertising. Maybe you have to do more direct mail. There's no guarantees with the way these districts break down that, one candidate is, ironclad, assured of winning. But it really does change the dynamic in how you campaign.
And the changes in districts affect other races as well. And one is Representative Ron Nate's race in eastern Idaho, a rematch against Britt Raybould, who is attempting a comeback, and that district has changed. It hasn't changed a ton, but it has changed enough that it might benefit Raybould rather than Nate, and that would be a big change. If she were to come back and be on JFAC again rather than him on JFAC, we can see all kinds of dynamics changing in the legislature.
And the primaries in that district, regardless of who came out on top, whether it was Raybould or Nate in past races, they've always been very close. But they had that sliver of, was it Bonneville County?
Yes.
That really sometimes benefited Ron Nate. And so, but he has been campaigning hard and he has been fundraising hard.
But Raybould has raised even more money. I mean, Britt Raybould has raised close to $100,000 in this primary. That is very unusual. And there are a handful of races that are in that, hitting that threshold or passing that threshold. We're seeing a very expensive round of legislative races in spots.
Right, right.
Another race that I'm keeping an eye on is Senator Fred Martin from District 15 in Boise, which has been something of a swing district in recent years. It was just back in 2018 that he only won re-election by 6 votes in the general. And this time he has a challenge from Representative Cody Galloway in the same district. She is a sitting representative from the same district. She's challenging him in the primary. And that's also a 3-way race. And so, that also could affect where things go in the Senate, in the House.
And I know that there are a lot of races I'm going to be watching in central Idaho. Carl Crabtree has a strong primary challenge. The new districts around Lewiston are very different than they were for the last 10 years, so I'll be watching a lot of those. Big changes regardless of what happens on Tuesday. We're going to have a very different House, a very different Senate.
And a very different budget committee between retirements and potential losses, turnover in these primaries. You could have a lot of turnover in the most powerful committee in the legislature,
including in its leadership. I mean, Rick Youngblood, the co-chair, is not seeking re-election. Carolyn Troy, vice chair, has retired. I mean, it's going to be a whole different ballgame. Also, we have so many House members running for the Senate, and many of them are kind of from the far right contingent who have complained that the Senate is not favorable enough terrain for House bills, and some of them have a good chance of being elected to the Senate. One example is Ben Adams, who is running for an open seat, and Tammy Nichols is running for the Senate. We have a lot of back and forth and change going on.
Akunowitz is another example.
Absolutely, Doug Akunowitz. I believe he's unopposed.
I believe you're right.
Yeah.
Wait, so let's talk a little bit about the fundraising. You mentioned the legislative races are, in some areas, very expensive. State superintendent's race, you have reported on how it's surprisingly expensive.
We're seeing something in that race that we just have not seen in the past 20 years. Debbie Critchfield has raised more than $300,000 that we know of, because obviously, we're not going to get the final numbers until after the primary. That is a 6-fold increase over what we've seen in the most, in the past primaries in that race over the past 20 years. I mean, if not for Critchfield, we'd be talking about how Brandon Durst has raised more money than anybody running in these primaries in the past 20 years. It's a very expensive, by that metric, race. I mean, this has usually been it's a down ticket race. There's not a lot of fundraising. There's not a lot of spending. This is a very different race, and you're seeing a lot of Critchfield ads on television. How that shakes out in the primary is an open guess, though.
Right. Thinking back to 2014, when Andy Grover outraised and outspent all of the other Republican candidates in that superintendent field, Sherry Ibarra by far was the lowest fundraiser, and she still won.
I could make a case for all 3 of them winning on Tuesday. Critchfield simply because $300,000 and a huge increase in a huge advantage in fundraising, the ability to advertise, that helps. Brandon Durst has really kind of carved out the lane, trying to get the hardline conservative vote. That could be a path to victory. And Sherry Ibarra, she's 4 for 4 in state races, a lot of times grossly underfunded relative to her competition. So you can't really count her out either. I mean, like I say, this one could go in any way.
There are also a lot of endorsements in that race and a lot of other statewide races. Let's talk a little bit about that. Historically, do those endorsements tend to make a difference in those statewide races and primaries?
I think that endorsements certainly can make a difference. I mean, we've seen really some prominent mainstream endorsements for Debbie Critchfield from people like former Governor Butch Otter and Congressman Mike Simpson. And look at the Attorney General's race. I believe it was just today that Lawrence Wasden announced that he's been endorsed by Brad Little and 3 former Republican governors, Butch Otter, Dirk Kempthorne, and Phil Batt. These are big names. And so if there are people...
Meanwhile, Raul Labrador has endorsements from prominent national figures like Senator Mike Lee and Mike Pompeo from the Trump administration.
That's right. But Do people in Idaho, when they're deciding who should be their next attorney general, wonder what Mike Lee from Utah thinks or somebody from Kansas? It will be new if that is how it's going. But yeah, endorsements are rolling in, they're rolling out, and they only matter if the voter feels like that's who I want to look to help me make my decision. That's someone I trust with this decision. So we'll see.
And one of the more interesting endorsements of the week, the Idaho Education Association came out with endorsements in state races. They're not even bothering to endorse in the primary for state superintendent. They've gone straight to endorsing Terry Gilbert, the Boise Democrat, who's running unopposed next week. Now, that's not in and of itself surprising. I mean, Terry Gilbert is a former president of the IEA. He's a career educator. You would expect the IEA to eventually endorse Terry Gilbert in September or October. They are not even taking a position, and basically they are varying degrees of critical of all three of the Republicans running for state superintendent.
And speaking of Republican Party infighting, there was a very high-profile fight this week with the Idaho Republican Party suing the Bonneville County Central Committee. Betsy, what was this lawsuit about?
So the Bonneville County Republican Central Committee not only has been endorsing its favored candidates in the Republican primary against other Republican candidates running in that primary, some of them incumbents, it's also been making cash donations, and it sent out a sample ballot, which I think was what really tipped this over the edge, that said, these are the official Republican Party picks. Vote for Brian Smith, vote for Janice McGeehan. And the Republican Party doesn't do that. That's not what the state Republican Party. And so basically they're accusing the county party of going rogue, and that phrase was even used in the lawsuit, and we now have the state party and one of the county parties facing off in court over this.
Other county parties and central committees have made endorsements. What's the difference here?
Well, this one in particular had a bylaw that said they could not do that, although I understand they have now repealed that bylaw. And so I'm not sure exactly how that plays out. There are allegations in the lawsuit that not only party rules, but state laws have been broken.
One of the candidates that you mentioned that got that endorsement from the Bonneville County Central Committee, Janice McGeehan, the lieutenant governor this week said she called on current Governor Little to call the legislature for a special session to remove existing exemptions in Idaho's trigger law that would go into effect if Roe v. Wade is repealed. And those exemptions would be for rape and incest.
And the life of the mother.
Life of the mother. You reported on that this week. Mm-hmm. What did you find out?
Well, a couple of things struck me. One was that Lieutenant Governor McGeehan was very vehement that she wants no exceptions. All three of those would be gone. Another is that both sides in the abortion debate completely objected to her proposal to call a special session of the legislature now, to change the law now, when the law is in a state of flux. And basically neither side thought there was any sense in messing with it at this point until we know what's going to happen. And what we're talking about here in Idaho's trigger law is a law that the legislature passed in 2020. It's not that bill that passed this year about the 6 weeks and the lawsuits that's tied up in court and hasn't taken effect. That 2020 law that's on the books doesn't have 6 weeks in it. It doesn't have any time period in it. All abortions would be felonies unless they fit those 3 extremely narrow exemptions. And McGeehan said she wants to get rid of the 3 exemptions.
Now, and what's interesting about that, compared to other states that would prosecute the woman seeking the abortion, this goes only after physicians. And
Correct.
That is where the legislative Republican caucus is right now. What stood out to me about Lieutenant Governor McGeehan's statement was it's so far removed from what we heard from House Republicans over the last few years, the majority of them. We've certainly seen proposals to prosecute women for murder for seeking an abortion, but those didn't even get hearings. But this takes that a couple steps further.
I think that the lieutenant governor has very clearly made an attempt to stake out the farthest, most extreme, no exceptions position on this issue, and she's done it consciously, and she's done it right before the election to say, this is where I am. If you vote for me for governor, this is what you're going to get.
And you said you spoke to lawmakers about that proposal, including some who are anti-abortion.
That's right. I spoke with Representative Brent Crane. I spoke with Representative Laura Nicochia. And both of them were very much taken aback with the call for a special session to remove those exemptions, and neither of them liked the idea for very different reasons.
You know, with the election coming up on Tuesday, what are you anticipating in terms of voter turnout?
Oh, it's always such a question. How many Idaho voters will actually go to the polls in a primary? Because in the past, so few have. It's only a very small percentage of our electorate that has bothered to turn out for primary elections. Now, it has been going up a bit in recent years, and I think it's possible that with the huge interest that's been generated in these big races that in many cases are actually being decided in the primary, that maybe we will see higher turnout.
Any predictions, Kevin, on what turnout might be on Tuesday?
Not really in terms of the numbers or in terms of the makeup. I mean, you would think that maybe a higher turnout, maybe more of a crossover vote, more of a, that a higher turnout might favor more of the centrist candidates, the mainstream Republican candidates, and a lower turnout might favor the hardline candidates. But who knows? This has been such a turbulent election cycle that predictions are hard to come by right now.
A turbulent election cycle that has already lasted more than a year. Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press, Kevin Richert, Idaho Education News. Good luck reporting on Tuesday. It'll be a long night, and the a turbulent night. Regardless of what happens, and the Idaho Reports team will be continuing our coverage online. Look for our election primary results roundup on Wednesday. You'll find the links at idahoptv.org/Idaho Reports. We'll see you next week.